Welcome to our political breakfast and debate. I'm going to very quickly just tell you what the setup for the morning is. Each of the four candidates have 7 minutes to speak to the group. And as we said, we have live streaming, not live streaming, but it will be on YouTube and Access. So we're hoping that this message goes out and out and out. The candidates in their 7 minutes were asked to address these 3 questions. Question 1, just as women are underrepresented in the political field, so too are they underrepresented in the STEM fields. STEM, of course, being science, technology, math, and engineering. What actions do you think the next government should undertake to address this disparity? The second question was, human trafficking is an issue that affects all communities in Canada, including here in Regina. What actions would you prepare to undertake to address human trafficking in Canada if you're elected on October 21st? And the third question was, of the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Report, which, if any, would you address within 6 months of the election if you had the power to do so? For example, if you are in a ministerial post. So when we asked our candidates to come and speak to you today, we wanted very much for them to address those 3 questions as well as whatever message that they want to share with you. So I encourage you to as you're listening to them in their first 7 minutes, to ask yourself, do they actually address those questions? And do they address them fully enough for you? Following the 7 minutes of each of the candidates, we are going to take questions from the floor. So on each table, there's some notepads and paper. So maybe you could grab one of those right now. And as the candidates speak, or if you came with a specific question, can you write it down on the piece of paper? And Michelle, if you wouldn't mind, and Eloise helping me, if you have a question, just hold it up. Hold up the piece of paper, that has the question written on it. And Michelle and Eloise there in the back will just bring them up here to the podium. And that is so that we can address as many questions as possible within the time frame we have. So in regards to the questions, the candidates have 1.5 minutes to respond to the questions. And they'll be going in different orders to give them different chances to breathe and collect their thoughts as we go. So if you have a question as they go along, or if you came with one particularly, jot it down, please legibly. Thank you. And it'll be brought up here and we'll address it during the time frame we have this morning. So as we get going, as I said, I'll introduce each of the candidates, and we're going to put them in it's hard to choose. What order do we call them up in? I said, let's put them in the order they showed up this morning. And so our very first candidate this morning is Winter Fedek, and Winter is the candidate for the Liberal Party for the riding of Regina Louvain. Please help me warm welcome for Winter.
Oh, good morning, and thank you for coming, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Before I start with my response to the questions, I'll just let you know a little bit about myself and why I decided to get involved. As was mentioned, my name is Winter. I'm the Liberal candidate for Regina Louvain in the upcoming election. I've called Regina Louvain my home for 35 years. I grew up in the northwest part of the city, in the Norman View West area. Went to McClurg Elementary School and Martin Collegiate High School, graduating in 1996. And ever since I was in high school, I've known that I wanted to give back to my community and to my country, and that's meant a couple of things over the years for me. The first is volunteering in my community. I've been a volunteer for my local community association, which includes helping to prepare for the Cathedral Village Arts Festival, which is a lot of fun every year. I've also worked with organizations that support people with intellectual disabilities, and as well have been matched with a refugee family from Afghanistan in 2011 through the Open Door Society. So those are some of the things that I like to do in my spare time. In my professional life, giving back has meant a rich and rewarding career as a public servant. So I've been a public servant for the last 20 years. I've worked in the federal government in Ottawa for organizations like the Privy Council Office and Foreign Affairs. Here in Saskatchewan, when I moved back in 2010, I worked for the Department of Finance, for example, and most recently was at Social Services as an executive director. I thought that public service and in government was going to be my path, that I would be supporting cabinet, supporting ministers until retirement. But the last few years have been challenging and have challenged my direction. and encouraged me to get involved. I'm not a fan of the Trump-style politics that's coming up to Canada and creeping into our political discourse. I think it's dangerous, and so I decided I wanted to get involved and to use my voice in that way to talk about that. And when I decided to get involved, I had to look at which political party I wanted to be part of because I was new to this, and so I had the opportunity to pick. And I picked the Liberal Party because I'm a fan of a lot of their platform initiatives over the last few years and the ones to come. Things like pharmacare, which touches me personally. I have a medical condition that requires medication that costs $2,000 a month. Because I'm a provincial public servant, I have benefits, but not every Canadian does, and I think that we all should. I also support the Canada Child Benefit, the investments in the Canada Pension Plan and old age security, which disproportionately benefits women. So those are some of the things that I'm supportive of. In terms of the questions, it was actually a really happy exercise to do this because we have done a lot of good things in each of the areas that we talked about. So the first question is around STEM and the underrepresentation of women in that space. And it's not uncommon that we have underrepresentation in those kinds of fields because of the systematic bias and assumptions that are ingrained in the workforce and some of the processes and institutions. So for example, in STEM, when women are in university and teaching in some of those areas, the tenure track starts at exactly the same time as you might be thinking about having a child. So those are some of the processes and the institutions that are disproportionately affect women. To respond to this, I think representation matters, and so women need to see themselves as they're growing up in these fields, and we need to celebrate and profile women who have done good things in those areas. But we also need to do investments, hard, cold, direct investments and support. And over the last 4 years, the Liberal Party has done a number of investments in this space, including creating 84,000 work placements in this area, investing in organizations like the Canada Foundation for Innovation, the Research Support Fund, the Social Sciences and Humanity Research Council. So all of those investments will help women to become more involved. The second question around human trafficking is another area that we've done some good work in lately. Just in early September, the Minister Goodale, after a year of consultations, announced a human trafficking strategy for the Government of Canada. This includes almost $60 million of investments in doing things like developing a national case standard, reviewing our immigration system to ensure that we're kind of catching those flagged areas where abuse might be taking place, developing a human trafficking hotline, those kinds of things. And it's significant because the vast majority of people who are affected by human trafficking are women, and the vast majority of those are under 25. So these are young girls who are being exploited. So it's a very positive thing that we're doing something about it. In terms of the third question around the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report and which area I would focus on, it's kind of a no-brainer given my social services background. It is the child welfare section. It's also because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was one of the top 5 recommendations in that report, so it's a very significant area for First Nations and Indigenous people. Earlier this year, we passed an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families, Bill C-92. And the intent of this bill is to work with Indigenous organizations to give them the opportunity to take on that function of child welfare in their own communities. Right now we have over 40,000 Indigenous children in the child welfare system across Canada. That's over 50% of the children in care, despite the fact that they are less than 10% of the overall general population. So the traumas of residential school system, of the lack of dealing with some of these issues over time has meant that child welfare is an area in need of reform. And again, it's one of those areas where that systematic bias plays itself out. So for example, some of the rules that we have around whether or not we take a child into care depends on, does the mother, typically the mother, have enough bedrooms in the house to house the children? And we have it specified in legislation and regulation how many bedrooms they have to have. Well, on the other side, our programs of welfare and housing supports don't provide enough funding so that that person can have the bedrooms that they need. So there's some conflicts there that, as the minister, I would definitely be working with Indigenous organizations and provincial governments on in the future in this space. So with that, I will turn it over to the next presenter. Thank you very much.
Before I introduce the next speaker, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about BPW. BPW stands for Business and Professional Women. And that's a title that we've struggled with over the last several decades, because when business and professional women started over 80 years ago, women who worked outside of the home either worked in some kind of business, like retail, for example, or they were in the professions, such as teaching or nursing. And that's where our roots come from. And so we've held on to the name, but we generally go by BPW. And here in Regina, BPW Regina. There's a club in Saskatoon, BPW Saskatoon, clubs across the country, and clubs across the world in more than 100 countries. And not only do we represent women and work on improving the status, economic, social, and political status of women in our communities, we work all the way up to the UN level, where BPW International is a Category 1 status, which means that we have input at many levels within UN discussions, and that's very exciting to be such an organization that makes such a difference in the world. So we're very pleased to be able to, as we do with every election, municipally, federally, or provincially, is to hold a political breakfast and debate so that we can highlight the women who have stepped up and are willing to live in the fishbowl of politics and to put themselves forward. So I'd like to congratulate the 4 candidates for putting themselves into the political sphere, because this is something that is not an easy thing to do. So our next candidate is Tracie Sparrowhawk, and Tracie is representing the PPC, and her riding is Regina Quipel. Please help me welcome Tracie.
Okay, well, thank you for letting me speak here. I'm really excited. I'm excited to be representing the People's Party of Canada, but just first a little bit about me. I'm a mom, I have 4 kids. I've been married for over 20 years. I'm an audiologist by profession, so I treat hearing loss, prescribe hearing aids. I love that work, and I've learned so much, work with seniors and different age groups all the time, so I really love it. I decided to get into politics. I've always been a political junkie and trying to keep up on current events and that kind of thing. So when this opportunity came up, I really love the People's Party. It's the fastest growing political party in the country right now. We haven't seen, no other party has grown as fast as we have, over 40,000 members in just over a year of starting, candidates in every riding, so we're ready to go. So I'm just going to take some time to answer these questions. The first one about STEM. So it is recognized that women in Canada do not pursue degrees in this field as much as men do, despite the potential for the higher income. According to statistics, Canadian women made up approximately 1/3 or 34% of all recipients of STEM bachelor degrees in 2016. According to a Harvard Business report, they are also more likely to leave their roles in STEM fields, with the majority of women citing isolation, hostile male-dominated work environments, and a lack of effective sponsors as the reasons behind their decision. So, since education is an individual choice, the government should have no involvement in addressing this disparity. Experts and professionals in the STEM field say that the industry itself needs to do a better job promoting STEM to young girls and women. Women are very diverse and can choose from whatever job or career they want. This is 2019. The majority of women may not be work-centered. Rather, they want options that balance work and family. And they can range from working full-time, part-time, or if they have the desire and the means to stay home with their children. The People's Party of Canada believes in personal responsibility and individual freedom, and with that, we want to lower taxes for all Canadians so women have the flexibility to make choices that are right for them. In addition, our bold reforms to balance the budget in 2 years, to use Section 9210 to get the pipelines built, to end corporate welfare and reduce the numbers for immigration will effectively benefit women with more job opportunities, less competition for jobs, and having more money to manage their households. Now the question on human trafficking, it's a scourge on our society. People are not commodities to be traded to the highest bidder. And with the lack of a national strategy, the difficult nature of laying charges for human trafficking, the number of convictions in Canada has actually been steadily declining for 3 years, even as the number of reported incidents went up. In 2016, 107 people were charged with human trafficking in 68 cases and 10 convictions. In 2017, 78 people were charged in 47 cases with 5 convictions. Current studies have found that due to challenges in prosecuting human trafficking cases, prosecutors will often proceed with other complementary or less serious charges. For example, where there's difficulty in proving a human trafficking offense, a sex trade-related charge may be pursued. This may explain the large proportion of human trafficking cases resulting in decisions of stayed or withdrawn. In about 2/3, or 64% of human trafficking cases with a guilty finding, the perpetrator was sentenced to custody. And in about 1/3, or 32%, the perpetrator was sentenced to probation. If I'm elected MP for Regina Capel, I would work to ensure that the perpetrators are sentenced to jail time, not held in custody or granted probation. Maximum sentencing would apply. And the People's Party will reduce the numbers for immigration with a focus on economic migrants who have a job when they come here, who are accepting of our Western Canadian values of equality under Canadian law, equality for men, women, and other minority groups, freedom of speech and expression. New immigrants would undergo face-to-face interviews, and temporary foreign worker permits will be eliminated, which will deny access to anyone who comes to work as a stripper, an escort, or in a massage parlor. To eliminate the illegal border crossings in Quebec and at other official entry points, the whole border would be declared an official point of entry. RCMP and border security agents would be given the resources they need to be able to refuse entry to people entering illegally. Now, on the missing and murdered Indigenous women report, the People's Party of Canada does not have any policies around this report. I read in a CBC News article that there were several discrepancies and errors in the report, and CBC News contacted the Inquiry Commission to ask about discrepancies in the figures and statistics, and after communicating with the Commission for over 9 days, it acknowledged one error while denying others. The statement, Indigenous women and girls now make up almost 25% of homicide victims, should have referred to their percentage share of female homicide victims, which is a smaller number of people. It's one of a number of statistics in the inquiry report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that appear to conflict with numbers collected by the Government of Canada, or with other numbers in the same report. There were several other errors in this report which were corrected, but the original report is still available online, and according to the CBC News article, no erratum or acknowledge of changes accompanies the new report. There is no public notification of the fact that there are now 2 versions of the final report in circulation, nor has there been any attempt to reprint the original copies, one of which was given to Prime Minister Trudeau on June 3rd. We realize that Aboriginal issues are complex. Many injustices have been committed by the Canadian government toward Aboriginals. We cannot rewrite or change the past. We must look at how to move forward together with a relationship based on a mutual respect, with an approach to balance the need of the Aboriginal populations with the rest of Canada. So a People's Party government will explore options to replace the paternalistic Indian Act, which keeps Aboriginals in a state of dependency and allows the federal government to control most aspects of their lives, with a new legal framework that guarantees equal rights and responsibilities to Aboriginal people as Canadians and promotes the self-reliance of communities. And this was also mentioned by Jody Wilson-Raybould, that the Indian Act needs to be dismantled. And so all these, the rest of our policy on the Indian Act is available online on our website. So thank you.
If you have any questions and you've written them down, just hold them up and we'll start having them come up to, just look around at your table. Thank you very much. So before I introduce the third candidate, I want to just reiterate one of the projects that our President Susan Sutherland mentioned in her opening comments. Careers Unlimited is a project that Business and Professional Women Regina has been doing for more than 40 years. And the whole value of Careers Unlimited is to have young women in their high school years to be aware of all different types of careers, not just the careers that they've seen their mothers and their aunts and other women in their community do. Everything from fighter pilots to military, similar, engineers, just a real gamut of the kinds of careers that young women had never even thought of. And so this event that we're running in May, as I said, has been running for more than 40 years. And so if you're interested at all in participating in that project, either as a resource woman, because we have 100 women from all different careers help us out that evening, or if you're tied to a school and you haven't heard about this project and you're within 100 miles of Regina, please go on our website and connect with us to make sure that this is a project coming into your school so that girls from your community can come to this project. BPW is focused on improving the political, social, and economic status of women, both here in our community and worldwide. I'd like to introduce our third candidate, Dale Dewar with the Green Party, and Dale is representing Regina Qu'Appelle. Please help me welcome Dale.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you in general to the Business and Professional Women of Regina for holding such an event that allows us to showcase our best talents at public speaking. Anyway, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the fact that we are on Treaty 4 territory and acknowledge that we were very fortunate. The people who lived here for 2,000 or years or more before us did not treat the land as we have treated it. Why I'm running for the Green Party? I was an environmentalist in late 1950s when Silent Spring was printed by Rachel Carson. My partner and I became concerned about climate change in 1976 when Ramparts magazine, a subsidiary of Playboy, published a glossy article on the topic. And I became concerned about militarism, violence, and violence conversation in 1968 when my husband introduced me to the Canadian Fellowship of Quakers, Canadian Yearly Meeting. And then I'm also very thankful to my parents. I am a physician. I'm a physician from close to Wynyard. Never once did my parents say, no, you can't become a doctor. If I'd said physicist, they would have said that was okay, too. They were farmers. They didn't have much money. They put quarters away in the 1940s when I was born so that I could eventually have the opportunity to go to a higher education. They installed the same belief in all of my siblings, all 5 of them. And I think I'll tackle the questions already. Question number 1, we know we're underrepresented. As someone who came out of a Bachelor of Science in the 1960s, I was horrified to find out that my oldest daughter went through some of the same barriers in 1990. I think they're still there today. When I watch TV with a little guy or girl in the morning, I don't have a TV at home, but there could be one somewhere, I'm rather upset about the children's TV advertising. Little girls are still passive. Little boys are doing all the active things. It is within the federal government's scope to alter the way in which media presents women and girls, men and boys. I believe we need to speak up louder and louder about that. We're not just, and we have allies. There's more than 50% of us, women. We have allies within the entire community of LGBTQ1-2 spirited people. I don't think I got all the numbers, sorry, but you know what I mean. So that makes us more than 50%. So why, and we have allies. My husband was an ally in that field because, and he was the father of 3 daughters who was only too happy to have his 3rd daughter on the way. So that's one of the places I would start. I think that the federal government has already made moves to be exhibit parity in their hiring processes at the scientific and technical levels. I believe that they've also made more youth employment spaces available in the same technical and with broader possibilities. We know we need future scientists. We need to put parity behind that and allow our girls to do it too. Question number 2, human trafficking as an issue that affects all communities in Canada. First point in this one is that we must never demonize or stigmatize the victims because they're victims. The Green Party has something to say about that, about human trafficking, and that human trafficking is actually the result of other factors. Poverty. Poverty makes people more likely to be susceptible to human trafficking. And since most of these people are trafficked to become sex workers, one of the other factors the Green Party would do is legalize and make safer environments for sex workers. We've often joked about it being the oldest profession. Sometimes there's a way, we need to admit there must be a way in which we can adjust to that. That would mean that once that happens, then it would be we would be more able to come have the human trafficked women come forward, because we now know who is a legitimate sex worker and who is not. The third question. This was a real challenge because you know there are more than 200 recommendations in the Commission's results. And Minister Fedek over there has referred to the same group of recommendations that I did. And I have a bit of a personal connection to these ones, but I would like to read them out to you. They are 12.4. We call upon all governments to prohibit the apprehension of children on the basis of poverty and cultural bias.
Thank you, Dale. Here you go. We could have given her a few extra seconds for the little having to go and get water and coming back. It's always challenging, you know, to determine how many minutes do we give candidates. Is it 5 minutes? Is it 7 minutes? Is it 10 minutes? And when you're up here, 5 minutes can feel like an eternity. And so I want to commend these 4 women who are coming here this morning to talk to you, and especially once we told them that we were going to live stream it. I think that put a little more challenge in standing up here and doing what they've done. So I really want to commend them for coming today. Our 4th candidate is Hayley Clarke, who is representing the NDP, and she's with Regina, Wascana. Please help me welcome Hayley.
I'd like to express my thanks and gratitude at the opportunity to speak with you all today, and thank you for coming out. I've had a number of experiences in my life that have helped me to change this country. I was born in Terrace, BC, and lived the first 5 years of my life on the Niska Nation. It was an exciting time to live there as the Niska Nation was hammering out the first modern-day treaty in Canada. Living in a cross-cultural situation has given me a fairly unique perspective on the struggles that face peoples whose cultures are discriminated against and on the battles faced by the Indigenous people of this country. In 2000, we moved to Burns Lake, BC, where I attended French immersion. After that, I was raised in Vanguard, Saskatchewan, a small village of about 134, 75 kilometers south of Swift Current. There I learned that volunteering, global citizenship, and hard work are a necessary part of life. I graduated high school and spent 2 summers working and living in Val-Marie, Saskatchewan. I enrolled and completed in the French as a second language certificate at the University of Regina, and I have worked in retail, service, and the tourism industry in Saskatchewan. I understand well the challenges of trying to pay student debts and everyday costs on a minimum wage. Gender equity is a fundamental value for the New Democrats, and we're recommitted to building a Canada where no one is left behind. Right now, Canadian women make 32% less than men, and the gap is even wider for racialized women, Indigenous women, immigrant women, and the women with a disability. A New Democrat government will prioritize pay equity to put an end to gender-based wage discrimination and require employers to be transparent about pay and implement and enforce tough and proactive pay equity legislation and regulations right away. STEM fields have been a particular barrier for women, which is why we're speaking on them today. One solution is implementing quality, affordable, not-for-profit childcare that is available to all Canadian families, no matter where they live. An NDP government would also make parental leave more flexible, make it easier to qualify for employment insurance, and support more options for women to build careers in the trades and non-traditional fields. It's also important that we tackle the issue of student loans here in Canada, as the price of tuition should not be what it is, and people should not be having to choose if they deserve an education based on how deep their pockets is, and whether they have the money to raise a family or gather an education if they so choose. After the Conservatives refused to address the tragedy of the missing and murdered Indigenous women for almost a decade, the Liberal government finally launched a long overdue inquiry, but then set it up with a limited mandate and failed to adequately care for the families who courageously shared their stories. The inquiry's finding of genocide against Indigenous women in Canada demands action from all Canadians. The report from the National Inquiry must not sit on a shelf. I stand with the New Democrats, who all work in partnership with Indigenous women, the families of the missing and murdered, and communities to implement the inquiry's calls for justice and the calls brought forward by communities. This includes establishing a comprehensive plan to address the violence against Indigenous women, girls, and LGBTQI2 people, ensuring that those fleeing violence have access to culturally appropriate programming, emergency shelters, and traditional housing. This does not stop just with how we have let down the Indigenous people without taking their missing and murdered properly. We have let things go on for too long. How can we look for our women when we also have not fully implemented the Spirit Bearer Plan for the Indigenous Services of Canada? How any Canadian can sleep at night while Indigenous communities lack potable water, solid infrastructure, equitable opportunities, and while knowing that the principles of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada report have not yet been adopted. Regarding the last question, I think that we have a real problem in the human trafficking and exploitation right here in this country, and very few people realize the scope of this problem. The victims of this crime are predominantly women, many of them minors, who are trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. The past and current federal governments have failed to take the necessary actions to address this problem. To solve the problem of trafficking and exploitation, we require a comprehensive strategy that includes reducing the economic inequities in our country by addressing poverty and improving education, and at the same time, we need to make sure that the laws that allow our justice system to have the tools to tackle this issue and take on organized crime, who is at the root of human trafficking world. At the same time, we need to make sure Canada is a welcoming country to new immigrants and refugees, and we are able to do our part in welcome people who are fleeing struggles and hardship in their own countries. And that we have to find survivors of these crimes in our country, that we are providing them with the care and support that they deserve. I would just like to say thank you for everyone listening with me today. I know it's a little bit shorter, but I really appreciate taking the time. Thank you.
So before we move on to the questions from the floor, can you join me in giving a round of applause for our 4 candidates? And thank them for being here this morning. I'd also like to thank everyone else who came here so early. Luckily it's when we got here, the sun was up, sort of. But when there's an election in the deep of the winter and we have a political breakfast, and not only do you come to it in the dark, you leave and it's still dark out. It's nice to have an event like this when it's not quite so dark and cold out there. So as the candidates speak to the questions that we have already, please, if there's any further questions, write them down, just hold them up, and a couple of our members will bring them up to the podium here. So the very first question I have is regarding women and disabilities, and I'd like to just start at your end there, Winter, and Winter will respond, then Dale, then Hayley, and then Tracie. Now, we're going to rotate who starts first just to make it a little fair, because by the time the 3 people have answered the question, it's a lot easier to have your thoughts in a row. So we want to be fair to all the candidates. So we're going to start with this question with Winter. 24% of Canadian women have disabilities. Women with disabilities face 10 times the rate of violence compared to non-disabled women. What is your position on improving the lives of women with disabilities? And you have an hour. You have a minute and a half to respond to the question, and if you could just keep your eye on the timekeeper, and she'll keep you on that minute and a half.
Yeah, sure. No, this is an area that's important to me. As I mentioned, I've worked with people with intellectual disabilities as on a volunteer basis, but also personally have a disability that requires significant medication costs. So I think it's a hugely important area, especially since a number of disabilities are you can't see them, right? So we underestimate, I think, how many people struggle with these kinds of issues. One of the things that the Liberal government has done over the last 4 years is worked on accessibility legislation that codifies in legislation some of the rights and responsibilities for people with disabilities, not just women, but all people with disabilities, which I think is a great starting point for having a conversation about how to make our spaces and built environment more inclusive, how to ensure our processes are fair and equitable. The other thing I would mention, I think, is around, things like poverty that's been touched on, housing investments. Those are all things that, in terms of social programming, the Liberals have done a good job as well. More needs to be done, and so that's why there has been some commitments in the platform around boosting some of these programs and services, especially I mentioned earlier the old age security and increasing that amount for people over 75 by 10%. Typically those are women who could, because they live longer, and typically they have disabilities that relate to age that affect their quality of life. So those are some things that I support of the Liberal platform.
Thanks, Winter. Dale, would you like to respond?
Well, as referred to, women with disability are overrepresented in poverty, and they're also really isolated when they are in rural or remote areas, and their services that are available to them are often very limited. As someone who has worked in the far, far north, things like standards for electric wheelchairs are simply can't be done on a road that has no pavement. So there is no understanding between me trying to negotiate for my patient and what was happening in Ottawa in terms of what the money could do. We believe that our guaranteed livable income would assist many of these people to be out of poverty. But I think you mentioned another thing, or inferred another thing, and that was people taking advantage of poverty-stricken and disabled women
with relationship to assaults or sexual or otherwise violence when the question was asked. And I think that one of the things that we need to be is that all people who are workers in the field working with disabled people are educated to recognize the signs of violence that may occur to them. Thanks.
Hayley, would you like to respond to the question?
Yes, so as it's kind of been touched on, obviously a person with disabilities is twice as likely to be living in poverty here. What we see from that is, with women here with disabilities, is that if they're living in poverty, we need to get them out. And we don't need to be taking anything away from them, but rather implementing something like a federal minimum wage so that everybody has the equal opportunity, as well as people being encumbered by their health costs. And women should not have to go through any of those, where pharmacare is something that is very easily implementable and should be an option for all here, and that those costs should not be something that should stop someone being able to work or live their lives, and have the system be able to take advantage of them in those regards.
Thank you. Tracie, would you like to respond?
Okay, thank you. Yes, there's been a lot of good points brought up here about the challenges of women and disabilities. A lot of it revolves around health care for women and disabilities. So health care is actually a provincial responsibility, and the federal government just gives the money to the provinces and they decide how they're going to spend it. So the People's Party of Canada is going to rework that program so that provinces will be more accountable for the way they spend their money. And as well, we're going to work, like I mentioned earlier, work to lower taxes so that people making $15,000 or less will pay no income tax. And we have had that in our platform for a while, and actually the Liberals just announced they were going to do that too. So I guess it's a good idea. Anyway, that's what we want to do. We want to make sure people have more of their own money to spend. We want to make sure the provinces are accountable for the federal dollars that they're getting and that they're spending the money appropriately. And we will be able to invest in better quality programming and services for people with disabilities. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracie. Thank you for responding to that question. Our next question, we will start with Dale and go Dale, Hayley, Tracie, and then Winter will respond to the end. Climate change has been in the forefront of the media recently. If elected, what is your party's platform to specifically counter climate change that has occurred over the past 100 years?
Climate change. Almost the entire Green Party platform is centered around climate change as one of the basic principles, and has indexed all of the proposals with special attention to how we might mitigate or prevent any further climate change. We've set a very ambitious target for 2030 and believe that with the changes that we plan to put in place, this can happen. I'd like to point out that practically everything that's mentioned in our platform has been done somewhere else in the world. And all we're doing is asking to transfer that expertise to Canadian soil and among Canadian people, because we think we're pretty smart. And then the other part that we need to deal with is working through some of the many ways we can already alter and have begun to alter the way in which we use our resources in this country. We believe that we can, if we stop subsidizing and sucking at the petroleum tip, that we can actually convert Canada to sustainable energy.
Thank you. Hayley? We believe that no activity in Canada should occur unless it is viewed through the lens of reducing the impacts of the climate emergency in which we currently exist. In order to do that, we need bold moves increase economic diversity, find effective ways of sequestering carbon emissions, reduce the dependence on coal and oil, upgrade public, private, and housing infrastructure, make our citizens accountable for environmental damage, and most of all, tax the corporation whose activities are threatening the environment. If we don't start with the big guys who are making the biggest and most negative impact on our environment, how can we expect the citizens to want to stand up and help preserve our environment as well?
Thank you, Hayley. Tracie?
Okay, thank you for this question. I was waiting for it. So the People's Party and I personally do not believe that there is a climate emergency happening, and we do not have any federal plan to implement any kind of climate change policy. We will leave that up to the provinces because the environment is a shared jurisdiction between the federal government and the provincial governments. So if provincial governments want to implement their own carbon or environmental climate change scheme, that is up to them how they do it, and we would rather leave it to the private sector to come up with their green technology and things that they can do to contribute to caring for the environment better. The Liberals and the Conservatives have admitted they won't achieve the Paris Climate Agreement targets, so the People's Party would withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord and any other UN agreements because Canada is actually a carbon negative country, and our footprint is very small in compared to countries like China and India, where they're the biggest emitters, and we don't see the climate activists going there to challenge them. Why are they always coming here? And even the carbon tax does not apply in Quebec, where they have their own cap and trade system, as well as Saskatchewan has its own cap and trade system, but the government didn't recognize that. So that's our stand. We're not buying into the climate emergency hysteria, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Tracie. And lastly, Winter, if you'd like to respond to the
Sure,
question.
yeah. Well, I have a 13-year-old son and an 11-year-old daughter, and I'm certainly buying into the fact that we need to do something with climate because increasingly our young people are anxious about the future. Adults are not having a good conversation about what that transition plan looks like. It's either we need to go back to where we were 10 years ago or some version of a future that can't exist given the current state of our infrastructure. So that's one of the reasons that I strongly support the Liberal plan on climate change. We have done things like implement a price on pollution to change in behaviors and incentivize a transition to greener technology and greener energy sources over the last 4 years. And going forward, we have a commitment to get to net zero by 2050, which is guided by science and experts about how to best get there. And every 5 years do a check-in around whether or not we're meeting our goals and adjust as required, which I think is a very responsible approach to going forward. It's a longer-term plan which balances the need for economic development and certainly the realities here in the West around our current resource jobs in our sector and needing to ensure that people who are working in that area can still put food on the table. We can't turn off the tap overnight. So there's a plan for that. And generally speaking, I think that this will be the last election where we're having a fight about whether or not we need to do something about climate change. I think that going forward, we're all going to accept that we need to do something, and the question is how best to get there.
Thank you. Thank you for your response to that question. Our next question, we will start with Hayley and go Hayley, Tracie, Winter, and then Dale. Over the past 5 years, the current federal government has decreased by 2/3 the Indigenous communities that had no potable water due to water contamination. What is your party's plan to reduce this challenge to zero?
So it is something that the fact that even 2%, any Indigenous community, any community period living with non-potable water, living with non-solid infrastructures, anything along those lines is completely unacceptable. These are our Canadian citizens. We need to take care of the people here in our country as well as everyone else. And what it is that we need to start actually carrying through on our promises that we make. We need to ensure that we're not looking at Indigenous communities as just something out of the way that they can throw money at. They actually need to do something that will implement creating like wells on these lands, making sure that we are not polluting their water with any like bigger corporations or any pipelines running through their land. And so it's something that this needs to be addressed right away, and that it's not something that can wait any longer.
Thank you. Tracie?
Okay, thank you. So like I referred to earlier, that we would abolish the Indian Act that keeps Aboriginals in a state of dependency. We also realize that it's absolutely appalling and disgusting that people in Canada are living in third world conditions, and that we realize that all Canadians benefit from roughly the equivalent services wherever they live, and so we want to ensure that Aboriginal communities will take more ownership of the services they receive in partnership with Ottawa and other levels of government, and we're going to review the federal programs to make sure that programs are targeted to benefit the Aboriginal population, in particular the communities that have the greatest needs. So, thank you.
Thank you, Tracie. Would you like to respond, Winter?
Sure, absolutely. So this is an interesting area for me. I took a leave of absence from the provincial government here to pursue the nomination, and this election didn't have the resources to just not work. So I've been actually working up in Nunavut for the last 6 months, and this has been one of the areas where I have been doing some learning around the infrastructure and the supports for water and wastewater treatment in Indigenous communities. We've invested, the Liberal government has invested $2 billion in this space and has lifted 80 advisories over the last 4 years, and has a commitment to lift all advisories within 2 years. A lot of folks I've heard is saying, why isn't this happening faster? And my experience up north has given me some insight into that, because certainly some of the locations that we're talking about for these areas are isolated, remote, you can't get there. I know, for example, in the north, you have 1 month that you can bring all of your equipment to build a new water plant when the ice breaks up. So very limited time frame, very hostile infrastructure building conditions. That is affecting the pace at which we're working. And the other one is training. So it's about ensuring that we're not just going in and building a water treatment plant so that there's a potable water source, but it's having those folks understand how to use that infrastructure themselves and train them. And because things are becoming increasingly automated, that's an additional challenge that we haven't had before. So I had the opportunity to travel to a couple of different communities up north. I saw the bucket with the chlorine where they had a paddle and they were seriously, that's how they did the water treatment. And then I saw the big, beautiful recent investments where they're struggling to train their staff to monitor. Yeah.
Dale, would you like to respond?
Well, I think that Minister Fedek here and I could get along very well. My retirement practice of medicine has been in Nunavut, and I have puzzled over how one would bring all of those communities, or isolated, far apart, small ice shelves, failing on the land, eating on the land industry. How do these people become sustainable? And certainly, living rural myself, I'm very, very well of the importance of good well water. I was just about to say training, write down the word training when Winter came out with it. But I think that in addition to training, we have to set up something that is a follow-up with the Indigenous people that have been trained to look after the water. But the other thing is an upstream approach, and that is was mentioned by another candidate, and that is looking at the pollutants, the fertilizers, the other use of the water before it reaches the communities. What is happening in the Athabasca should never, ever have been allowed to happen. There are whole communities that have been unable to use, are never able to use the water again because of what has been happening in the tar sands. So those were my 2 points, and they've been mentioned by other brilliant women. Wouldn't we be fantastic in government?
Thanks, Dale. My next question is going to start with Tracie, and it will go Tracie, Winter, Dale, and Hayley, and in that order. And the question is, what role do you think the federal government has in helping increase women in senior leadership in organizations?
Okay, this government has no role. This is like something that's done in organizations to decide for themselves. Women may be in leadership for many reasons. They may decide not to be in leadership for many reasons. It's entirely up to the woman if she wants to pursue a leadership role in an organization. It's up to her to prove herself that she is capable of carrying out the duties and is able to handle the stress. Most women don't want to work extra hours, especially if they have a family. They may not want to travel that much because of their family commitment, and government should play no role in getting involved in business. China does that. We are not China, so the People's Party would have no role.
Thank you. Winter?
Well, I think it's BS that the government doesn't have a role in supporting women in the workplace. There's a number of different things I think that can be done, including things like blind hiring. So when CVs are coming in, you remove the name so you can't tell the gender or ethnicity of the person, and you're just evaluating on credentials and capabilities. The other one that I've particularly benefited from over the course of my career, and even in this process politically, is around mentorship. So, you know, having other senior women take the time to work with younger women, to mentor them through how to navigate the workplace, how to, deal with some of the challenges that we have in the workplace, including things like adequate workplace supports. So as a mother, it has been a challenge to get to daycare after work, and you're very limited in kind of the options after work and during work hours that you've got. So those kinds of things, more childcare in the workplace, I think would help. But generally speaking, I think there absolutely is a role for government to play until we get to gender equity in the workplace.
Thank you. Dale, your comments?
Thank you. As a woman who's often been in the position of leadership, I think that the most important thing that I've ever done is the mentorship role, is looking for, and sometimes it's not always been another woman, but looking for and mentoring someone to take over the position that I was for which I was leading. So certainly those of us who have the opportunity should be aware of other women. I was challenged by a co-convener of a major conference that we should have 50% of the speakers at the conference be women. It was more or less a scientific conference, and he challenged me to find women in those fields. I looked for them and found them, but I didn't know them before because they weren't as well advertised, seen in media, been in front of convocations or other opportunities that I had been for learning. They just hadn't been there. They hadn't been chosen by the program organizers. So there are, we have to be aware of our own ability to be leadership, to take on those roles and act within them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hayley, would you like to respond to the question?
So when it comes to this, I really stand behind the blind hiring. A job should never be offered to someone based on whether they go by Miss, Ms., or Mrs. I myself have been to interviews where the first question is, when are you looking at starting a family? And was warned early on that, depending how you answer that, jobs may say, well, you're going to be a mom in 5 years. You, of course, can't be in a place of leadership. And along those lines, is completely unacceptable why people are being passed up for promotions because they think, oh, you can't juggle both. But maybe that's where we need to tackle affordable childcare so women do have the same opportunity as men, as well as mentioning, like, people, even though they're out in these fields, they're not as well represented. I have a friend who's a welder and probably one of the best I've ever seen. And that's not just me being biased, but it's actually been said to her by her bosses. But their first question is, when are you looking at starting a family? before they even consider putting her into a place of management. And that's something the government needs to ensure is not happening, and that it doesn't matter when people want to start a family. They have the opportunity to still be in a place of power, because we're not leaving them to their own devices on the sidelines as well, but we're taking care of everybody in all regards.
Thank you very much, Hayley. Thank you for the response to that question, candidates. Our next question will start with Winter responding, and then followed by Dale, Hayley, and Tracie. And this one is very specific to your party and your opinion of your party. How do you feel the leader of your party has dealt with the issues of bullying and harassment within your party? And we will start with Winter. How do you feel the leader of your party has dealt with the issues of bullying and harassment within your party?
Yeah, well, this is a significant issue, because in the process of thinking about whether I wanted to do this, that was probably the number one factor, is do I want my daughter to read people calling me horrible, grotesque names on Twitter and Facebook, just because I want to have a conversation about more than pipelines and the carbon tax. I want to talk about issues that matter to women, like the Canada Child Benefit, poverty rejection, increasing supports for seniors on pensions. So I think, generally speaking, that my leader has done a good job on this front. It was made very clear to us as candidates that this is a campaign of positive politics. Talking about other folks in the election, you can talk about the record, but things like whether or not their family or whatever the case might be is off limits. So I really appreciate that. It's a lot harder, though, to be positive and to not get into that negativity. That just people get a response easier with negative politics. So it is a challenge. And I think it's a particular challenge for attracting women in politics. So that is one of the things that has been important to me through this process, is to try and keep the conversation focused on policy as much as I possibly can, and ignore, the memes that are going back and forth about, ad hominem attacks about somebody just because they've put forward their name for consideration in the democratic process. I think we need to get back to a place where we have respect for that versus kind of jumping on it if we disagree with some of their positions.
Thank you. Dale?
Well, the leader of the party expresses the desires of the party and the principles of the party to be have no tolerance for violence or bullying within the party. All of the candidates are vetted very closely for their opinions and on all of these areas, or the behaviors in the past, and so that it's not part of the candidacy. But having been subject to the experience of online bullying, during this campaign already, I can tell you how much energy it takes out of the candidate, so that it could also be seen as a very political act in order to silence the candidates. So I would say that the leader of my party has stood with me, and I'm very pleased to say that we can criticize the state of Israel and not be considered that we are opposed to Israeli people or Jewish people anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Hayley?
I believe that the federal leader has a very good stance on harassment and bullying, which is zero tolerance. It is something that people, as was mentioned by Winter here, that wanting to enter the political field, you shouldn't feel that you are giving up your right to not be harassed, to not be bullied, to not have comments made about you online, not just from outside the party, but also any harassment from within the party. And I think that the NDP did a great job with vetting their candidates and choosing a very diverse team, because of course a lot of the candidates know what it's like to have been harassed or have just been picked on for certain things that they can't choose, and so it's very important to ensure that there's zero tolerance for that from within other candidates and just the people of Canada itself.
Thanks, Hayley. And Tracie, the last to respond.
Well, our leader, Maxime Bernier, has he's very pro free speech and freedom of expression. He allows the candidates to express whatever views they have, whether they're controversial or how controversial they are. And he has stood behind every candidate when something has happened. One of our candidates in Red Deer is a very vocal on social conservative issues like abortion and transgender activism in the education system and parental rights. And she's absolutely free to speak on those issues. He stood behind her 100% on those things. We have other candidates gravitating to our party who have been disallowed to run from other parties for that reason, that they've been harassed and bullied and not allowed to run because of their certain stances. So he's a total free speech advocate, and he allows us to speak on the issues that are important to us.
Thank you, Tracie. Now, we have time for a couple more questions, but if there's any still from the audience here, please make sure you jot them down and we'll bring them back up and work them into the mix here. The next one here, Dale will respond first, then Hayley, Tracie, and then Winter. As women are living longer, unfortunately, they're outliving their living. And a lot of women who are over 70 are struggling to deal with daily bills. What is the plan that your party has for women of this age group living with dignity? Dale?
Thank you for the question. The guaranteed livable income, of course, would provide a much needed income at that time. It would provide the bridging from what may have been a higher income to a more sustainable and income. The party is also believes that we need to have a way of increasing support for communities so that people do not live so far in isolation, that they have other people around them, a community in which they need to live. And that means that supporting rural people and rural elderly in the places that they already live is one of our priorities. Thank you for the question.
I think that this question starts kind of at the bottom. It doesn't start when you're already a senior. It starts when you start. And implementing a federal living wage would be something that definitely would help people as they go along with their lives, being able to afford things in the beginning and being able to save money. But also the livable income that was Dale mentioned here is obviously we wouldn't expect someone else to live off $800 a month or the obscene amount that it is right now, but it's something that it needs to be that they can cover their rent, they can cover their houses and travel time and anything like that. Obviously, as you mentioned, rural community as well as getting to the bigger centers where there are hospitals. Maybe we need to move those hospitals into smaller centers or at least have more accessible health care as well as pharmacare. These expenses as people age, and I'm not going to say that I'm experiencing them right now, but I can see my parents going through it where more and more they have to pay for these things that they need to in order to survive. My mom might lose her vision in a few years if she can't afford the eye drops she's forced to use. Why should her retirement mean that she can no longer afford life-saving medication? Thank you.
Thanks, Hayley. Tracie?
Okay, well, the People's Party has pledged to lower taxes for low-income people. So if you're making, like I said, if you're making less than $15,000, you won't pay any tax. If you're making $15,000 to $100,000, it would be a 15% tax, and $100,000 plus would be a 25% tax. We also want to dismantle supply management, which impacts all of us. We're paying 4 times the cost for dairy, eggs, and poultry. So we want to get rid of that program, which is only helps about less than 20,000 farmers at this point in time. We will eliminate the carbon tax, which has been, it will affect everyone at the you know, in everything, that the price we pay will also increase the amount of GST that we're paying on everything, because we pay according to whatever the price is. And the Liberal government was challenged on the carbon tax, how it affects women, because they're so focused on gender equality, and they could not come up with a why or how they costed out the carbon tax for women compared to men. And women do the disproportionate running around of kids. Elderly women probably have to drive themselves everywhere, so they're going to be paying more for gas, more for food, more for power. We'll also eliminate corporate welfare because, you know, we don't believe Loblaws, a $1 billion grocery chain, should be getting $12 million to purchase fridges that they were going to purchase anyway. So that's our plan.
Thank you, Tracie. And Winter, our final answer.
Great. Well, in my introductory comments, I mentioned that this is one of the areas that attracted me to the Liberal Party in the first place, was their focus on seniors and ensuring affordability and equality of life there. So there's been increases over the last 4 years to the Old Age Security Program and the GIS, changes to automatic enrollment. So now instead of having to apply for these benefits, you're automatically enrolled, which ensures that people aren't losing out, particularly women, as again, they are the disproportionate beneficiaries of these kinds of programs. The effect is that that's lifted thousands of seniors out of poverty, and going forward we have a commitment to improve the survivor's benefit for these programs, and again increase the Old Age Security Program by 10% for people over 75. Other investments that help in this space are around the housing strategy and the bilateral agreements that we've signed with provinces and territories on that one to increase the affordable housing stock, looking at the poverty reduction strategy with measures and targets that we can track progress to and hold the government accountable for those things. We also have a commitment to develop a senior strategy with seniors for seniors. So you know, women themselves, senior women themselves, can participate in that and tell us what it is that they need exactly. It's interesting, somebody mentioned, I think Dale mentioned, you know, the loneliness factor. In the UK, they actually have a minister responsible for loneliness, because they've recognized that elderly people, and particularly women in isolation, it's negative impacts on their health. So that's another area that I would look at over the next 4 years. Thanks.
Thank you, Winter. Now, we just have time for one more question. If your question was not addressed, the candidates will be here for a little while after the event when we wrap up. And so please stay and talk to them specifically about whatever issue you brought with you today, if we didn't cover it in the questions that we had for the time. Before we address the last question, I want to thank everyone for coming out so early. And I want to thank the candidates for their candid answers and their willingness to run for office and to encourage other women through their role modeling to run for office. Now, I do believe we started with Tracie with that one. So we'll start with Winter with this one, followed by Dale, Hayley, and finally with Tracie. Proper childcare, specifically subsidized and accessible childcare, is a key to women moving into professional and senior management roles. Do you think there are sufficient numbers of spaces? And if not, what do you think the federal role is in changing this situation?
Thank you for the question. When I moved back from Ontario, back to Regina in 2010, I won the lottery. Out there, it was $1,800 a childcare space, and here it was about $700. So across Canada, this is absolutely an issue that we need to look at to ensure that there's the portability of that program and service so that people can take advantage of that. In terms of the numbers of spaces, I think that we're tracking well in terms of increasing those spaces. We've made investments over the last 4 years and have a commitment to double the early childhood and early childhood learning and childcare framework, through which we provide funding to the provinces and territories for these childcare spaces. So we have seen a significant increase in Saskatchewan on that front in partnership with the province of Saskatchewan, which has been a lot of good work there. Some of the challenges, though, are around the kinds of spaces right now. So we're in an increasingly precarious labor environment where the traditional 9-to-5 jobs don't exist to the extent that they did before. Lots of people in contract work or freelance kind of work. working irregular hours. So that's one of the areas where in this new investment that we're making over the next 4 years, if reelected, it will include some of those, after hours or overnight spaces, so that women, such as nurses or whatever, can have access to that. But again, as we mentioned before, childcare is a huge priority for ensuring that we've got women in the workforce. Thanks.
Winter, Dale?
Yes. Without children, we don't really have a society. So childcare is extremely important. And it's extremely important for both parents as they enter the workforce. I think another way to approach it also is to make sure that we have adequate funding for training and availability, and that the job, the employment of being a daycare worker is considered, is well rewarded in salaries as well. This cannot be seen as something you do in your spare time. You are, in fact, the parent's educator and caregiver of those children while you're at work. So that we need to have a social elevation of what childcare is all around, across the board with parents as well. You don't just have a kid because it's a good idea. You have children because you want to love them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hayley?
Regarding the price of childcare, I almost choked on my breakfast at that. Even here in Saskatchewan, $700 a month is absolutely ridiculous. Something affordable childcare really needs to be brought in. Just for instance, here, working minimum wage, yes, about 4 years ago, I took home about $9.26 biweekly, and I remember that number very exactly because my rent was $9.17 a month. That was one of my checks gone instantly. It's showing here, if I had had some children and needed to put them into care so I could still work, that leaves me with about $200 for the rest of the bills. And you can't even register, you can barely register a car for that or pay your cell phone bill. So implementing affordable childcare is really something that needs to be brought forward, because that should not be a statement that shocks me to my core when all Winter here is trying to do is make sure that her children are looked after while she is at work and while her family's at work. As well as mentioned here by Dale, that making sure that the appropriate staff has been trained, that there is enough staff to care for the children, and that we're not stuck with these 9 to 5 kind of schedules where people have to leave their jobs or they don't have the care available because they're just scheduled from a 9 to 5. That's very important.
Thank you, Hayley. Tracie?
Yes, well, I had 4 children, all in daycare while I worked, and I would have preferred to stay home, honestly, but because we're, with bills and everything, and I do have a professional career. If I was working a minimum wage job, there would have been no point for me to go to work and spend all that money on childcare. So I would have made more sense to stay home. And I believe most women, if given the opportunity, like Dale said, we have children because we want to love them. We don't want to let other people raise our children if we have a choice. And because we want to lower taxes and keep more money in people's pockets, maybe some women will be able to stay home. They won't have to put their kids in childcare. But I believe families should have the ability to choose the type of childcare they want. The government should not be mandating any, providing spaces. Again, that would be a provincial responsibility, and up to a company whether they want to provide childcare spaces at work, which I think is a great idea. And yeah, so we don't have a policy around that, but we would want to let everybody choose for themselves and lower taxes to make it more affordable.
Thank you, Tracie. And that's the last response to our last question of our debate this morning. And what is the role of having an event like this for all of us to come up so early in the morning? Is really, first of all, to highlight women who are running in the political process, regardless of what their political party is. For us as other women, to support these women in doing the really important work of democracy, which is allowing yourself to be right in the front of the cameras, literally and figuratively, and to really share that idea that, politics is a perfectly logical role for women and women of all ages. And so if one of these women up here today is your candidate for the women in the audience here. Please take a few minutes and get to meet them personally and ask them whatever question that you have that's burning on your mind that may or may not have been addressed during our Q&A period. And I encourage you also to share this event with other people. We'll be sending out the link so that you know where the recording is and where you can find it and share it with other people here in the city of Regina, but also I think there was good information shared as far as just party platforms this morning that I think informs us all. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn the podium back to Susan Sutherland, our president for BPW Regina, and because she has stuff to give away and we want to be there. So thank you very much.